In this video, we'll be adding and implementing the toggle control to the settings menu panel we built out in the first video. First, I'll add a new UI block called controls as a child of the body. I'll expand the width and height, and then set some margin to give some breathing room around the edges. Next, I'll add another UI block called toggle setting. This will be the root of our toggle. I'll expand the width and set the height to 80. Now let's add a label for our toggle. The way I want to set this up is I want to have all of the labels for my settings be right aligned to the center point. The way I can accomplish that is by right aligning the text block and then setting the position to 50%. Now as the text block resizes, it will resize out to the left. Next, I'll set the text to be toggle. I'll change the font to the Electrolyze font that we're using, set the font size to 48, and finally shrink the text block on both axes so that it matches the size of the text. Next, let's add a UI block 2D for our checkbox. We'll do the same thing that we did for the label, this time flipping it so that we're left aligned with a position of 50%, and then we'll also add a left margin of 50 to give some space between the label and the checkbox. Next, I'll lock the aspect ratio to keep it a square and set the size to 70, and finally I'll style the checkbox by setting the color to the backing panel color, adding a border using our accent color, rounding the corners, and finally adding an inner shadow using a toned down version of our accent color. The last visual item we need to add to our toggle is a check mark to indicate its state. So let's add one more UI block 2D. We'll expand both the width and the height. We'll set the color to white, and we'll use the checkmark texture, which is included in the UI controls samples that are packaged with Nova, and we'll also link to it below in the description. I don't quite want the checkmark to be that big, so I also add a margin of 16, and finally, just to spice it up, I add a gradient using our accent color on the bottom left of the checkmark. And with that, we've finished creating the visuals for our toggle control, so now let's implement the functionality. Since we'll eventually be binding this to a collection of settings, we're going to use Nova's data binding system, and if we take a look at the item view article in the Nova manual, we can see the two things that we'll want to add. The first is a data type that maintains the actual state of the setting. For toggle, this will be pretty simple, just a bool for an on or off value. So let's go ahead and add that. Let's switch back to Unity and create a new file called settings data types. In our settings data type file, let's add a data type for our bool setting. This will be very simple. It will just have a bool for the state. And let's mark this as serializable so that we can fill it out in the editor later. And even though our bool setting only needs to track a bool, we also want to be able to name all of our settings. So let's create a base class that all of our settings will inherit from, which will contain a string for the name. We'll also mark this as serializable, and then we'll have the bool setting inherit from this. Now that we have our data type created, if we look back at the diagram, we can see the last remaining thing we need to add is an item visuals class. The item visuals is responsible for linking the underlying data type, which is the bool setting we just created, and the view, which is what we built out in Unity. So in Unity, let's create a new file called toggle visuals. Now let's switch over to our toggle visuals class. First, we'll make it inherit from item visuals and mark it as serializable. And now let's add a reference to all the things that we might want to modify. So first a text block for the label, and then a UI block 2D for the checkbox so that we can modify its color based on the interaction state. And finally, another UI block 2D for the checkmark so that we can enable and disable it based on the toggle state. We'll also add a few colors that we can set in the editor that we'll use to change the checkbox color based on the interaction states. Now if we switch over to Unity, we can add the toggle visuals to the toggle setting that we built out. We do that by adding the item view component, and then from here we can select the toggle visuals class, and now we can serialize the things that we exposed. So the label, checkbox, and checkmark, and for the default color we'll just use the starting body color, for the press color we'll use the inner shadow color, and for the hovered color we'll just split the difference between the two. Now that we have that set up, the last thing we need to do before we can test our toggle is handle input. If we take a look at the input overview article on the manual of the Nova website, we can see a diagram giving us an overview of how Nova's input system works. Input starts with an input manager that calls into Nova's interaction API, so let's add an input manager to our scene. I'll create a new game object called input manager and then add the input manager script to it. The input manager script is included with the UI controls sample that's packaged with Nova. After the input system has been provided with input via the interaction API, it then looks for gesture recognizers. These are simply items in the scene that we want to receive input. So switching back to Unity, let's add the interactable component to the toggle's checkbox. The interactable is a gesture recognizer, so by doing this, we have denoted that the checkbox is something that we want to receive input. And finally, the last part of the input pipeline is actually handling the gestures that the input system fires. So let's create a new file called settings menu, where we'll actually handle these gestures. Here in the settings menu, first let's add a reference to the root UI block, as this is what we'll be using to register our gesture handlers. Then, until we properly data bind, we're going to need a temporary bool setting data source for our toggle. So I'll create a new section called temporary, just to be explicit. And here I'll add a bool setting as a data source, as well as an item view reference so that we can access our toggle visuals. Now we can begin to implement the functionality. First, let's add a bind method for our toggle, which will take in a bool setting as the data source, and then an instance of the toggle visuals class. And here we'll set the labels text to be the name of the setting, and we also want to set the checkmarks active state, so let's add a helper property to the toggle visuals class called isChecked, which will simply do that for us. And then we'll make sure to set the isChecked property based on the state of the bool setting. Now we can call this bind method in start. I'll add a comment above it to be explicit that this is temporary, and we'll use our serialized bool setting, and then we'll get the visuals from the serialized item view. We'll also register our gesture handlers, which we'll do by calling the add gesture handler method on the root UI block. This method is a generic method with two generic arguments. The first is the type of the gesture that we want to handle, and the second is the type of the item visuals on which we want to receive that gesture. There's also a version of the method with only one generic argument, which is the gesture type, but since we want to handle gestures differently based on whether they happen to a toggle or a slider or a dropdown, we're going to use the method with two generic arguments. And to the add gesture handler method, I pass in the static handle hover method on the toggle visuals class, but since that method doesn't exist yet, I let Visual Studio generate a stub for me, which we'll implement here in a bit. And then I do a similar thing for unhover, press, and release. And then I add one more gesture handler for click, this time passing in a method on the settings menu. And the reason I split it up this way is because these methods up here are visual only. They do not change the state of the toggle, while this click method will actually change the underlying state of the bool setting. Now that we have all of our gesture handlers registered, we can go ahead and implement them. First, we'll switch to the toggle visuals class, and here we'll simply set the color of the checkbox to the corresponding color based on the new state. And then in the click gesture handler, we'll simply flip the state of the bool setting, and then we'll set the toggle visuals isCheck state to be the new bool setting state. And we're ready to test our toggle. So if we switch back to Unity, we can add the settings menu script to the root of our settings menu. We'll serialize the root UI block. We'll give our bool setting a name, let's say camera shake, and then we'll serialize the toggle item view. And if we play, we can see that the label for our toggle has changed. The toggle responds to hover and press events, and when we click it, the state of the toggle changes. And now that we have our toggle working and our menu set up to receive input, that brings us to the end of this video. In the next video, we'll be adding the slider control.